Welcome to my presentation of everything that you didn't know that you wanted to know about Studio. I'm going to try to explain as many obscure or not well-known functionalities of Studio as possible in under an hour. With that, let's get right into it. I'll start from the top of Studio and work my way down. So what's at the very top? The File menu. Let's get into that. Looking through the File menu, I'll start out giving a rundown of publish versus save to Roblox. So this place isn't saved to the cloud yet. Let's save it to Roblox. Make a new game here, and let's just give this a test game. Save this to Roblox. And we'll see it was saved. And let's also publish it to Roblox. So I've now saved it and published it. Well, what do those different things do? So if I go to my Places section in Game Settings, and we go look at the version history here, we'll see there's 3 versions of this place. And one of the columns here is published. When I save to Roblox, it will add a new cloud version, saved on the cloud. When I publish, it will do the same thing, so make a new version saved on the cloud, but it will also mark that version as published. And when someone joins the place, what they're going to get when they join is they're going to get the most recent published version. So basically what that comes down to is if you publish, you don't also need to save. So if when you're finished with your studio session and you go to save to Roblox and then also publish to Roblox, you're doing extra work basically, because if you publish, it will implicitly have also saved to Roblox. You don't need the 2 clicks. So that's good. Let's go on to the next thing in the File menu. We have in the Advanced section, there is a Export as Object option. This will export the whole place as an object file. So we can just say like test obj, and this will just save it to an object file, which you can use in Blender or some other software to make a fancy render of the game. And also in the Advanced section of this menu, we have the Customize Shortcuts menu. This lets you assign any keyboard shortcut to any action you want. Basically anything that's a button or some kind of action in Studio, you can assign a custom keyboard shortcut to it. And that includes plugin actions, not just actions declared by Studio itself. So if I look for decomposition geometry, which is a useful thing, this is defined by a user plugin. I could also assign a shortcut to this just fine. It's not restricted to only built-in actions. So I'd recommend assigning some keyboard shortcuts to things that you use frequently. So a lot of people won't benefit a ton from like assigning a million keyboard shortcuts, but usually assigning keyboard shortcuts to like 2 or 3 things that you use like most frequently is quite useful. Finally, also in the File menu, we'll look at the beta features dialog. You may or may not have used these before. Basically, whenever Roblox is developing some new feature, before it goes live, just default to everyone, it will often be released as a beta feature. And if you turn it on in here, you'll get like early access to it. And you won't necessarily be able to use that feature in your live games yet. Often the beta features here will be something you could try out in Studio, but that won't work in the live game yet. But it's often useful to get up to date on like what the new kind of stuff coming soon is, and possibly make some features of your game, get started on using some feature and getting code ready to use it before it comes out. And what less people might know about is what this enroll in beta feature toggle here at the top does. This is enroll in beta channel. It's the name of this toggle. What this does, if you enable this, this will automatically enable any new beta feature that comes out for you. Like you might be confused because when you first toggle it on, it doesn't do anything. It won't like change the existing beta features. But when a new beta feature comes out, it will automatically be set to true if you have this enabled for your account. So not necessarily something you want to do if you're trying to get maximum stability, like you're trying to maintain your existing game and don't want stuff randomly changing on you in your studio might not be good to have on. But if you're just kind of experimenting, maybe in the early stages of developing a new game, it's quite useful to have this turned on to just get new fancy stuff showing up in Studio without you having to manually enable beta features. So that's our first section of the file menu. What can we go to next? We can go to the top bar. So this other stuff right at the top beside the file menu. So the first thing we have here is the quick access. That's this area here right beside the file menu. You've got some various buttons in here, and you can actually customize this. It's not just a fixed set of buttons. If you click this little drop down here, and there's a few options by default that you can turn on and off just in the main drop down, but there's also customize. If we go here, we can choose any action and add it to there. So again, we're gonna need this decomposition geometry option later for something else I'm gonna show. So let's add this to the quick access. If you click add here, by default, it'll just come here and say show up. And if we click OK, now we have this plugin driven thing just right here to click at any time in the quick access. So if you have some plugins that you use really frequently and you have way too much stuff in your plugin bar, like many developers, if you stick something right here in the quick access, you just have one-click access to it no matter what tab of the ribbon bar you're in. Next in this top bar, we have another thing which actually a surprising number of users make use of, but some people don't know about it. You can see this little arrow here. It says toggle ribbon visibility. If I click this, the ribbon bar will collapse, and now I no longer have a ribbon bar at the top of my screen, at least a permanent ribbon bar. I can still click any of these tabs to temporarily bring it up to click and get some access to some tool. But now when I click back to the 3D viewport, it'll go away again. This is quite useful if you're on a lower screen space device, such as a laptop. You can use this rather than having your 3D viewport area limited. Like if you're working mostly in the 3D viewport and are familiar with shortcuts, you might not need the ribbon bar up all the time and might want more space in your 3D view instead, which is where this can come in handy. And we can click this again to uncollapse it, so we have access to everything again. Finally, in the top bar, right next to the button we just looked at, we have the What's New button. If you click on this, you'll get a list of all the kind of most recent features which have been introduced to like Studio and the game engine. If you're the kind of person who checks the dev forum like a few times a week or something, always looking for the new stuff, then you've already seen this because this is hooked up to the dev forum announcement posts. But if you're not someone who looks at that all the time, it's quite useful to check this occasionally just in Studio to see, is there some fancy new stuff that's come out that's useful to me? Okay, next section, we're done with the top bar. Let's look at the just main ribbon bar. If there's anything interesting in here, that we're going to look through some buttons that are less obvious or their purpose isn't so obvious. First thing we're going to look at. Most people are very familiar with these buttons in the part section of the model tab. But what some people might not be as familiar with is this little button right at the bottom corner of the part section. There's some extra options in here. Color action is tool and material action is tool. And if you turn these on, you're going to actually get these color and material buttons invoking tools that let you click on stuff and color or change the material. So now if I click on here, I get a tool that lets me just use a paintbrush to change the color of parts that I click on. If you're trying to swap around some coloration or material settings for stuff in your place, it's going to be a lot more convenient than the default mode, which is just doing it to the stuff you have already selected without this color and material tool as action set. In the same section with the parts section of the model tab, we have the lock tool, which this should be very familiar to most people, but a lot of people may not have clicked this arrow and had see this unlock all option. And even if you have, this might not seem so useful. But there is actually a quite good use for this unlock all button. Say I'm just in my game and I'm like trying to click on some part and it's not working. It's like I have a locked part and I don't know where it is in the hierarchy. There's just some part and I can't click on it. Like for instance, this base plate. Say this was something I didn't intend to have locked instead of the base plate. I'm like, I can't click on it, don't know where it is and all this stuff. What you can do, you can select the workspace and hit this unlock all button, and now everything in your game will be unlocked. So now I can click on the base plate and just see exactly where it is in my hierarchy. It's not lost anymore. And then I can, of course, click undo, and everything will be back to the same locked status it was before. However, now I know where that thing is. I've effectively used the unlock all to find the thing that I didn't know the location of in the hierarchy. Another tool, going on to the constraints section. We could do a whole video on all the different constraints, how they work, etc., because a lot of people aren't so familiar with these. But for now, I'm just going to go over one in particular that may be very useful to people, even if you're not someone who uses constraints generally in your place. And that's creating weld constraints. Well, you probably already know the main create weld constraint tool. If we just click on two parts, there we go. We've created a weld constraint between them. But imagine I have a model with like 100 parts or something in it. I don't want to have to manually create a whole bunch of individual weld constraints by clicking on all those things. So this tool actually has a different mode. What we need to do is go into the Explorer window, select all the parts that we want joined together, and if we just click this Create Weld button, it's going to create a set of welds which fully joins those parts together. So no more manually creating all the individual stuff. And it'll be smart about it too. As you can see here, the welds are created based on kind of the touching surfaces and stuff. So it'll create a minimal set of welds too. It won't make any extra welds that we don't need under here when we use that option. This is very useful if you just want to quickly get something joined together using weld constraints. Next tool we'll look at here is the Insert Object button here. So most people are familiar with Insert Object in the context menu here. But if you go in the Model tab and look at this Insert Object button, you can actually get the Insert Object as a docked panel instead. So now I just have this Insert Object up and available. So if I'm trying to quickly create some new content, and I'm just going to be inserting a lot of stuff, I may want to use this Insert Object panel while I'm doing that, rather than having to use the Insert Object from the context menu. And finally, in the Model tab, we have the Run Script button, which this may not seem super useful at first, but if you have some kind of automations that you use a lot, or some task that you occasionally want to do and want to write it as a script, but don't want to like fully promote it to a plugin, then you could just write a Lua script, click that button, and run the script in the context of the place. So I had this create part script. I just ran script, and there's the part. So useful automation to have at times. Next, let's look in the Test tab. So many people may already be familiar with the device emulator. So if you're trying to test for mobile or something, you can turn on the device emulator, but the player emulator may not be as familiar. If I open up the player emulator, we've got a panel that lets me set basically the profile, like what player is playing my game when I'm in test mode. So if I go and play solo in Studio, this will set what the properties of the player who's playing in that play solo session is. So I can set what their language, region, and their kind of policies that affect them are via this panel. That's quite useful if you want to test your localizations or these integrations with external links, etc. Those are kind of obscure things, so being able to test that your code actually works without manually mocking any of this in your code is very handy. And finally in here we have this mute button. Often when you're programming something, you just want to be jamming to some nice programming music or whatever, and so you don't want the sounds from inside your game that you've heard a million times already and already are familiar with. You don't care about those sounds. So often it's nice you can use this mute button and you'll not get any sounds from in-game anymore when you test in Studio. You can listen to your nice programming music all you want. So I often have this on when I'm testing a game out that I have already set up full audio for. I don't want all that audio. I've heard it a million times. I already know that it works. So I can just use this mute button and turn it off. Next section, we've gone over some stuff in the ribbon bar. Let's look at instead this top bar. So this right above the viewport, we've got the tabs for some scripts and stuff, but we've also got these couple buttons over here, which are somewhat interesting. This UI toggle will let us turn off all the 2D UI. So you can see I've got this nice label of which section we're looking at right now. If I turn off this UI toggle, we won't see it anymore. So if you're trying to debug something in the 3D space and you don't care about all the kind of UI going on, just click turn it off. And of course, we've got a nice quick toggle for the player emulator as well, which lets you turn off the player emulator. Next section, we'll look at the context menu. So of course, what you get when you right-click in the 3D space, just what options are there in here. Some of them are very common stuff that we all know about, like copy and paste, but there are other things in there which may be less obvious. So first, if we right-click here, we've got our copy-paste. Like I said, we've also got duplicate. This one's, the shortcut for this is Control/Command-D. I'm going to just use Control in this presentation, but if you're on Mac, all of these commands are Command plus whatever instead of Control. So if we go duplicate this, it duplicated in place. That's the default for duplicate. But if we go check the collisions toggle in the Model tab and duplicate this other part, we'll use the hotkey of Control-D this time. They're going to stack on top of each other. So what behavior you get out of duplicate is actually controlled by this collisions toggle. Next, we'll look at what is possibly one of the most important shortcuts in just navigating around your 3D space in general while you're working. Which is if we right-click, we see we have a zoom to option here. I have to select something first to be active. But this is a super important option. So if I select this part and I right-click and I say zoom to, I'm right over here. Don't have to fiddle around with the arrow keys to get the camera where I want. I'm just exactly where I need by using that. And you should learn the shortcut for this, which it's not a complicated shortcut. It's literally just F. Press F to focus. So if I want to go back over here to our main stuff, select that part, hit the F key, now I'm right back over here. And a fun note on top of this with this function, this works with the terrain region stuff also. So say I've selected a region of terrain, and while I'm editing, say I'm editing terrain, and I've selected this like terrain region over here, and I hit F. It's going to work also. So this F shortcut works with all the terrain tools as well. It has integration with that. So let's go on to our next interesting thing, which is select after insert. What is that? Well, if we open, earlier I was talking about the insert object menu. We're all familiar with this. But it has some interesting options on this menu. For one, we've got this main toggle. Most people have probably tried clicking on this at some point, which expands the insert object to show us lots of stuff or only a few things at once. But there's also this other toggle next to it, which less people may have noticed. If you click this, we've got a couple options. First one is show only recommended objects, which typically I found people on Roblox would rather have this off because they don't want Studio telling them what things to put under what other things, because sometimes you just want to have unconventional objects nested underneath each other because it's useful for whatever gameplay purposes. So it makes sense to leave this off. But this second setting is also off by default, where I think most people want this on. It's select object after insert. If you have this on, when you insert a part, it's going to be, or anything else, it's going to be selected right away. And that's generally what you want, because what's the first thing you do after you insert something is generally start setting some properties on it to modify it to be the way you want. So I'd highly recommend turning on this select object after insert. So now when I insert a part here, we're going to see this part is selected by default. I didn't have to click a second time, do busy work to select it. Next off, we'll look at the orientation indicator. So I've got this seat right here. Well, so the direction of seats matters. If I'm trying to edit my place, I need the direction of the seat will determine which way someone points when they sit on it. So I'm going to need to know that. Well, how do I know it? In the past, a lot of people would use the surface types to do that, but that's kind of going away in recent days. So there's actually even a better way to do it. There's a built-in functionality for this. If you right-click in the context menu here, you'll see this align drag or this show orientation indicator toggle. So if I click this, now we'll see I have this thing next to the part showing me exactly which way it's pointing. And this shows me both the core direction, so which way the front face is facing with this main thing. And if I tilt also, you can see the green arrow shows which way the up direction is. So it shows you all the information you could want to know about the orientation of the object in a nice, convenient indicator. And we can turn this off again by right-clicking things that have it on, and now it's hide orientation indicator. Next section we'll look at is just some brief info on the output window. So first thing to know, we've got a bunch of junk in here. In the past, you had to right-click and clear output. Well, now there's just a nice clear button directly on the output. So 1 click instead of 2 clicks. Nice that it lets you have a 1-click thing to clear this. More important thing with this to understand, if we click this ... we've got some options for the output window. Most of these not that interesting, but this log mode option is quite interesting. So by default, let's say we print some table here and say like a equals 42 or whatever. If I print here, we're going to get this fancy table that has, you can expand and see details inside of it and stuff. This is the default to have this fancy output mode. But if you start spamming the output with a bunch of stuff every frame, like you're trying to debug some issue and you just need to dump out a whole bunch of information into the output window in order to debug your issue, you'll notice that the performance starts suffering a bit if you have this main output window mode. Well, if you turn on log mode, now it will use a simpler output mode, where if I output my table, it doesn't have a fancy expandable thing anymore. It's just simple. But the trade-off is when you turn on log mode, you'll never have a perf issue with the output. You can spam it with as much stuff as you can conceivably send to it, and you'll never have any performance issues. So depending what you're doing, if you need details, you use log mode off. If you just need to spam the output with a lot of stuff to debug something, then having log mode on is important. And one more thing about the output window, it might have annoyed you at times. You've got this command bar, which we can enter stuff to the output window. Well, they don't line up. So the command bar is over here, the output window is in the middle. That may have driven you crazy when you first ran into this. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. If we go into Studio settings and look for output layout mode, right now it's vertical. If I change this to horizontal, they line up nicely now. My output's all the way across the bottom. It lines up with the command bar. Most people would rather not have it this way because they'd rather have the vertical space for the Properties window, Explorer, and other stuff on the sides. But if you really want these two to line up, you have that option available in the Studio settings. So let's set this back to vertical and go on to some other points. So next, let's talk about the draggers, going back to the 3D view, now that we've kind of gone from the top to the bottom over the main things in the viewport here. Working with decals. If I have this part, it has a decal on it. Say I want to remove this decal. Do I have to go digging around in the Explorer window here and selecting this decal? I actually don't have to do that. If I just click on this part, it'll select the part. But if I click on the part again when it's already selected, it'll select the decal underneath it. So you can see now I have the decal selected. So effectively what this means is if you just double click on a part, you'll get the decal instead of the part. And now I can just delete it with the delete key as usual. So if you're trying to change around decals on stuff and you don't want to go digging around in the Explorer, you could simply click on the part to select it, click on the gain to get the decal, and effectively have double click to select decals. Next thing to look at, let's look at these parts I have here. If we look in the Properties pane at these, we can see the size is just some completely random number. These have been edited in some way that doesn't keep their size grid aligned. So how do I get these to align nicely as I'm editing whatever involves these? Well, if I drag one of these, we'll see, well, one side is lined up, but the other side isn't because they have weird sizes. What if I want this side to be lined up? Well, now this side is lined up. Now that side is lined up. What am I doing to choose this? So the way the draggers actually work is that whatever vertex you click closest to when you drag the part is the vertex that will get aligned. So if I click over here by this side, this vertex will get aligned to whatever I drag onto. Versus if I click over here on this side, whatever that vertex will get aligned to whatever I drag onto. So basically, the idea is whenever you're picking up an object to drag it, you should click on the object by the thing you want to align. So if I want to align this corner, I click on that corner to pick it up, and then when I drag, it's going to align nicely to whatever I drag it onto. Next, we'll look at tilt and rotate for the draggers. So most people probably know these shortcuts, but if you didn't, if I drag an object, so I currently have this thing dragged, if I hit the R key, it will rotate the part, or whatever model I have selected, it will rotate. And if I hit T, it will tilt that object. So using R and T, you can change the orientation of the thing you're dragging in 90-degree increments as you drag it. But what do R and T really mean in this context? What they mean, if I drag this thing, or well, so I gotta update this. If I drag this thing onto this surface, if I hit R while it's on this slope, you'll see it rotates around the slope. And if I go onto the side of this part, it'll rotate around the side of it. So specifically what rotate means is rotate around the surface normal. So the way that the surface is pointing, rotate around that. And T means tilt towards the camera. So we'll always tilt towards me, towards the camera. That's the way the T key works. And the idea behind this is that no matter what kind of thing you're editing, say I have some stuff stuck on the ceiling of the place I'm editing, these R and T keys will work just as well if you're working on the ceiling of your place as they do if you're working on the floor or the wall or anywhere else. They basically don't have any privileged direction. They let you work regardless of kind of how the stuff you're working on is oriented. Next, let's look at the Align Dragged Objects toggle. So by default, if I have this tree and I've got some terrain or level geometry that I'm trying to place it on, if I drag this and drag it on here, it's going to be slanted off to the side. Well, no tree is going to grow that way. So how do I fix this? Well, if I right-click in the context menu, we've got this option called Align Dragged Objects. If I turn this off, now when you drag something, it'll just stay exactly up the same way it was when you first started to drag, regardless of what you drag it onto. So for a tree or something, or a street light, or something that's supposed to be oriented like vertically against gravity, it makes a lot of sense to have this off as you're trying to place those objects. So now we've got my tree placed nicely on my slope without having to fix the orientation in any way. And again, that's Align Dragged Objects in the context menu. Usually useful to have it on, but if you're trying to place like props on your level, then it's sometimes useful to turn it off. Next, we'll look at the insert point behavior. So what is the insert point? Well, let's imagine I copy this part, and now I'm going to paste it. Imagine I have nothing selected. Where is it going to go if I hit paste right now? If I hit paste, this part's going to appear in the center of my screen. That's the default behavior when I have nothing selected. But if I do select something, let's say I'll select this target, and now I hit paste again. The part is going to be centered over the target that I had selected. And this works for movement too. If I have something and I move it, and now I paste, the pasted thing is going to appear basically where I last left my movement off at. And this is true. Any kind of movement or selection will cause the insert point to get set. And whenever you insert an object or paste an object, the object will show up at that insert point. Next, let's look at a kind of backdoor functionality that can be very useful in some circumstances. So earlier we mentioned we could duplicate a part with the Ctrl+D shortcut. Well, what's going to happen if I'm dragging this little stripe and I try to duplicate in the middle of dragging? So I'm currently dragging and I hit Ctrl+D. Well, it left the part there and I'm still dragging. I can duplicate again and again and again. I can basically stamp copies of this object I'm dragging by hitting Ctrl+D while I'm dragging it. This can be useful if you want to stamp a bunch of copies of the same object without having to manually place them all. It's a very quick method for placing duplicated copies of an object. Next, let's look at scope selection. This is something most people probably know, but if you don't, it will be a game changer. If I hold down Alt, well, I have one of the draggers selected. Right now, this is a model. If I click on it, I'll select the model. If I hold down Alt and click, I'll get the individual parts. So you don't need to get these parts within the model, you don't need to use the Explorer. You simply need to hold down the Alt key while you're clicking on them to get that selecting the object within the model instead. And this works with Shift as well. So if I hold Ctrl+Shift, I can multi-select parts within models too. It all works naturally. So next, let's move on to the physical draggers. Physical draggers. What are the physical draggers? So the physical draggers, if we go up to this Tools panel, we've got collisions, joints, surfaces. We've also got this mode selection. So if I click this drop-down, there's two options. By default, it's in geometric. If I click physical, we'll see that a lot of stuff changes. Transform is now grayed out, joint surfaces is grayed out, and all my draggers look different. If I look at them, they have a different kind of look to the buttons. So what has really changed here? The first thing we'll notice is that by default, the physical dragger is scope select by default. So if I just click, this is still the parts in the model, but if I click even without holding down Alt, I'll get the individual parts. So why would the tool want to do this? Well, the explanation is that these draggers work on physics rather than geometry. So they physically try to move stuff. So let's select this rotate tool and select this wheel. I've got this piston assembly. If I drag this, let's turn off rotate snap for better results here. If I drag this, this assembly will actually simulate as I'm dragging the part. And same thing, if I use the move tool, dragger on this endpoint, I'm effectively simulating the assembly as I drag. And that's why it selects individual parts by default, because you really want to drag a part, not when you're trying to physically move something rather than a model. So what about freeform dragging? That's the name for if I just click on a part and drag it without dragging any particular handle. So what's going to happen in that case with the physical draggers? They do something a bit different than the normal draggers. They'll drag in the plane of the camera. So we can see as I drag these parts, it's basically moving them in the plane of the camera, and this rope constraint is being respected also because it respects constraints and collisions. Collisions toggle is still available too. If I turn this off, it'll still respect the constraint, but it won't respect collisions anymore. The parts will be allowed to go inside of each other. And we can see, for instance, if I look from the top, now I'm dragging these in the plane of the camera from above instead. So anytime you're working on something with constraints and joints and stuff, can be quite useful to use this physical dragger mode rather than the geometric one. Or imagine I'm trying to make a campfire and I'm trying to pile up a bunch of fire logs and sticks and stuff to make this fire. You can drag those using this mode to make them physically based, basically. You can pile them up physically rather than having to geometrically adjust them until they look right. You can just take advantage of the physics engine for that through the physical dragger mode. So next section, we'll take a look at something outside of the viewport entirely. We'll talk about the script editor. So the first thing we'll talk about is Ctrl+P, the shortcut. That's Ctrl+P. If I hit Ctrl+P, I'm going to get this Go to Anything dialog. It's called Quick Open in the case of Roblox. In other editors, it's often known as Go to Anything. So I know I have a script called script1 in this place. I don't want to necessarily dig around in the Explorer window for this script. I just know it's called script1. So if I just hit Command-P and type script1 in here, now I can just, it's fuzzy logic as well, so I can type only part of it and it'll still find this. If I hit Enter, now I'm in the script. Didn't have to dig through the hierarchy to look for it to open it. I just directly got there using Command-P. And this doesn't only work in the... Whoops, my view got a bit messed up here. Well, this doesn't only work in the script editor. This also works for other stuff. If I know I have a part called spawn location, I can also type that and hit Enter, and I'll have it selected. So this will work with objects in general, those generally most useful with scripts. So let's look at some other functionality of scripts. Let's look at Ctrl+Shift+F. That's find and replace all. So if I Ctrl+Shift+F, I'll get this find and replace all dialog. And let's say, for instance, I just search something like local. Lots of scripts will have that in it. I'll get all of the scripts which have this item in it. I'll be able to replace in all of them as well. But finding, this isn't just for searching if I don't know about something. This is useful for navigation too. Because say I have this thing called foobar in one of my scripts somewhere, hit enter and double click one of these results. Now I'm over in that script. So if I know a function name that I want to edit from earlier, I don't have to dig around and find the script, find the part in the script. I can just use find and replace all. The Ctrl+Shift+F, enter the name of the function, and click to get there, rather than having to do all this extra navigation. So on the note of navigation, there's another nice function in this script editor, which is if I Control-click on a part of a script. Say I've got this module.foobar. What if I want to change this in some way? Let's say I added a parameter. I added this true as a parameter, and I'm like, I need to go implement the code to handle that. I can just get directly there. I can hold down the control key and click on this function. It'll just jump into there. It'll open up the script for me. It'll show the contents and jump right to the part I wanted to edit. So now I can like add this Emulator and start adding code to handle this. So that's super useful. What if I realize, oh, I didn't actually want to edit this? No, wait, that's not what I wanted to. How do I go back where I was before? We've got this back button that you can click. And this will just go right back where you were. So now I can go back, remove this parameter that I didn't actually want. And this is quite a powerful pair of things to use, especially if you assign a keyboard shortcut to this back button, which there is a default shortcut, but it's Control-Shift-, which I think is not a great shortcut. If you assign a keyboard shortcut that you can type only on a single hand using for this back button, for instance, I have it assigned to Control-Z. If you make it work that way, now I can Control-click to jump into something and then hit Control-Z to jump back. So without ever taking my hand off the mouse, I can navigate into and out of functions in this script to edit them and kind of jump around in my code. And I never have to bother with explicitly using the Explorer window to get to something or having to dig around in a script to get to something. I can just directly jump in and out of things using click and Control-Z. So for instance, if you look at that, it's very quick. I can almost instantly jump between these, where it would be kind of annoying to navigate between them otherwise. So that's a quick look at the script editor. There's tons of other script editor stuff we could go over, but I'll possibly do that in a future video. Instead, let's take a look at decomposition geometry. Well, what is decomposition geometry? That's a kind of complicated term. So what this is, we'll look at, if we go to Studio Settings and look for decomposition geometry. It's in the visualization section under the Studio. We turn this on and close. Go back to my viewport. We'll see my viewport looks a lot different now. All the checkered pattern on the base plate went away. This thing looks really weird. So what's going on here? The first thing we want to recognize is that it's really awkward to toggle this from the settings menu. So I have to emphasize there's a plugin we have to go get. For instance, it's this decomposition geometry plugin, which is basically just a quick way to toggle that setting in the Studio settings. So now since I assigned this, I can quickly toggle between the two with this plugin. And I have to emphasize, you must get this plugin. If you're working with mesh parts or CSGs in any way, you need to have this plugin installed. And the way you get this is you go to the toolbox, choose plugins, and search for Mesh Optimizer. We'll see this Mesh Optimization plugin. And if you click this, you can install it. And like I said, you must have this installed if you're doing any kind of CSG or mesh part based work. So once we have that installed, by default, you'll have it in your plugin section. And I would almost recommend having it assigned to the quick access. Like I use this a very large amount. So once you have this here, we'll go toggle between these a few times to kind of visualize. So you can see this geometry looks almost the same as the visual geometry we had, but not quite the same. So what this is the physics geometry of the part. So the parts look like this visually, but this is how they'll actually collide, is using this geometry. And why are they doing this? Why is it the geometry that they collide with different than their visual geometry? For this, I'll have to do a quick tangent into just some very basic stuff about how the physics engine and how the physics system in a game engine works. So physics is fundamentally, I have two things, they may collide, and if they collide, I have to resolve that collision somehow by pushing them apart. So for nice kind of smooth or just convex objects, that's very easy. If I have just kind of two things without any weird indents or odd parts sticking out of them, if I have them intersecting or colliding, I can simply push them apart to resolve that collision. That's very easy for the physics system to do. But I have something like this, which is concave and has these kind of indents in it. Things aren't so simple for the physics system anymore. Imagine I have two chain links, for instance, which are linked together, and I want to resolve collisions for those. Now I can't simply push them apart anymore, because resolving the collision may actually involve pushing them together or apart or not pushing them around at all. It's much more complicated for the physics engine to figure out. So instead, since handling convex collisions is easy and handling collisions for more complicated stuff is hard, the physics engine will break down the geometry for something complicated like this into convex pieces. So if you notice, each of these individual pieces that the part was broken down into is convex. So now the physics engine can basically collide each of these individual pieces on its own in an easy way, and then combine together those results to figure out what should happen for the whole combined part. That's more complicated. And the default for this is, of course, if I select this part, it has a collision fidelity option on it here. And there's a few different options for this, because how exactly it does that breaking down of the more complicated geometry into these convex hulls, that's what they're called, is convex hulls. How it does that breaking down can be done in a lot of different ways. So there's a few different options on how to do this. And which of these you choose is very important, because for this part, for instance, each of these little colored regions here, physics-wise, is basically as expensive as an individual square part. If you have just a square, generic square, wedge, or cylinder part, each of these individual regions in here is actually as expensive as a whole part physics-wise. So this thing is basically as expensive as like a couple dozen parts because of all these individual regions within it. So which of these collision fidelities you choose is actually very important for the physics performance of these mesh parts and CSG parts. So let's look at what our other options are for these. Again, we can set that by changing it in here. I've already got some other parts set up with this so that we can check them out. So first we'll look at collision fidelity box. So I've got my same CSG, but I've changed what the collision fidelity is. So if we turn on the decomposition geometry, we'll see it's just a box. Well, that's what it says on the tin, basically. Collision fidelity equals box. This will just wrap your whole mesh or CSG part in a box, and that's how it's approximated. That might seem kind of a bad approximation to use, but the trade-off you get is this is very fast. Use collision fidelity box, it's basically just the same cost as a normal square part. So if you have some object that's off in the sky or it's a purely visual part in some way, you really don't care what the collisions are like because it's not going to be colliding with anything interesting anyways. So in that case, you can just change collision fidelity to box to get the maximum performance out of your simulation. Second, we've got collision fidelity equals hull. So let's look at between these for a second. What exactly is this collision fidelity hull doing? It's shrink wrapping your object, basically. So it's finding one convex hull around the whole object, basically the smallest convex hull that will wrap around the whole object. And this is a pretty good approximation in most cases. and it's still almost as performant as just a normal part, because physics only has to do a single collision of this versus something else to handle it. So any kind of thing that's just a part, basically, like if you have some cylindrical or weird shaped thing that it doesn't have much concavity to it, like it doesn't have really weird inward sticking parts, this is generally the option you want to use for about 50% of like CSG and mesh parts, because it's fast, but it has enough detail to not be like have obviously different collision geometry. So what's the final option for the rest of it? I said that's kind of the option you want for about 50% of stuff. The final option you have is collision fidelity precise. So if we look at this, well, here the collision geometry looks almost exactly the same. If we toggle back and forth here, it is actually exactly the same as the visual geometry. And not only is it almost exactly the same, but it only took 3 regions to do this. So this decomposition geometry looks very good. So why isn't this the default then? This looks really good. The only cost of collision fidelity precise is that the algorithm to figure out what the decomposition is very complicated for collision fidelity precise. So if I take some complicated mesh with thousands of triangles and I set the collision fidelity to precise, Studio will chug for a few seconds. It'll have to sit there figuring out what the decomposition geometry is. But once it has, it's done. It's basically figured it out, and now it will be fast in your game. So as long as you're willing to sit for a couple seconds for it to compute the collision fidelity, this is almost always the option you want for meshes and CSGs that have some relatively complicated collision geometry and you care about the collision geometry. Like if you have a weapon that you're going to be hitting people with and you need it to accurately have the collisions, this is almost always the option you want to use. Because compared to collision fidelity default just uses way more segments typically to represent something. So this is a very good option. Like I said, generally about 50% of your stuff should be hull fidelity and 50% of it should be precise fidelity, and almost none of it should be default fidelity. You should almost always change it to something other than default, and that's why it's so important to have this plugin, because this plugin will let you quickly visualize what is the best option basically to use for your mesh. Because occasionally collision fidelity precise, if it's for something really complicated, can end up just making too much geometry. So you'll need to break down your mesh or use some other option. So next, let's move on to some other just kind of random game engine related stuff that doesn't fit in or anything else. Beams can be connected to bones. Very simple statement. For instance, if I hit run here, we'll see I've got this beam which is nicely rotating around. And I didn't have to move any part positions to do this. All that's being done in this case is my rotate script is changing the C-frame of a single bone. And I'm able to still have this nice kind of transformation because I've got a bone with another bone under it and I'm connecting the beam to that. So you can do some fairly complicated stuff getting beams to do some fancy effects just by connecting them to bones. So we stop here and go back to our main thing. Another really simple one to explain, Decals cast shadows. I really haven't seen anyone take advantage of this, despite the fact that it's quite a useful property of the engine, which is if I have this part, it's completely transparent. It's not doing anything of its own. It's the decal is what's casting the shadow here. This could be a nice property of decals to use in some effects or something, but I've never seen someone take advantage of it. So now that you know about it, maybe you'll be able to make use of this. Final section I'll go into is studio settings. So we'll just pull up the studio settings and go over a lot of studio settings that you may not know about or may not realize the use of. First thing to go over here, all right, at the top studio section, camera, these camera values. The default ones kind of suck. They're probably not what you want. So I'd recommend just taking 5 minutes or whatever and changing what these default camera values are to something that's more appropriate for the content that you're working on. Because, for instance, if you're working on little props, if you're someone who makes fancy little props, you want way lower values. If you're someone who's working on setting up the level geometry for a level, you'll want way higher values. Really, you want to customize these to something that works better for your specific use case. Second thing, plugins DIR. When you go to plugins and say launch this plugins folder, this is where all the plugins that all your local plugins, when you save something as a local plugin, that's where they go, and that's where they'll be loaded from. But in Studio settings here, you can change which folder this is. Well, where that may be useful is if I have, say, a specific set of plugins, local plugins that are useful for working on one place, but on other places I have a different set of plugins that are useful. I may want to have kind of two different plugins folders that I can swap between depending which place I'm working on. So you can like dynamically change this value to a different folder and basically hot swap out which set of plugins you're using with your Studio. You can already kind of do that by changing which account you're logged in as, but for local plugins, this would be the way to switch that out. Next thing, a lot of people I know already changed their selection box color to something else. Like a lot of people prefer orange or red as the default color for the selection box. But you can actually change selection box thickness too. And you can even change this to 0. There's no limit on this. So if I said 0 selection box thickness, I won't have selection boxes on stuff anymore. Or if I set it to something very small, like 0.01, even if I'm working on some very small detailed stuff, this will never get in the way of my work, because now the selection boxes will be really thin. So depending what you're working on, this is also a value you should really change around to something more appropriate for your particular use cases. Next, let's look at this auto recovery section. A lot of people work on really large places these days that have like just hundreds of thousands of parts in them. If you ever worked on one of those places, you know it can take a while to save. Sometimes the autosave can come at an inopportune time and you're just sitting there waiting for Studio to finish the autosave. So you're working on one of those large places, you probably either want to turn off the auto recovery or change this interval to something else more appropriate. Or just turn it off and rely on manually saving so you don't get interrupted by long saves at inopportune times. Next thing to look at is this command bar operates on local state at breakpoint. This is false by default. What happens if you turn this on? This is not obvious at all what this kind of means. So I've turned it on. Let's close this and let's go to one of these scripts. So let's go to script 2. I've got these, just some basic code. And let's put a breakpoint on here because that's what the setting is relating to. And we'll hit run. So we hit run, we'll hit this breakpoint. Let's go to the output window and let's print. If I say print A, what's going to happen? I haven't defined A in the command line anywhere. If I print A, I'll see 5 as the result. Well, that's the value from the local variable in the script. So when you turn that setting on, the command line will actually operate. If you're at a breakpoint, it'll operate on the contents of the script. So I can actually run code against details of the script, like the local variable state and stuff. That can be extremely useful if you're debugging some kind of stubborn issue where you really need to drill into the details of the data in your script at that point in a non-trivial way. This will let you run just arbitrary code against that contents of your script rather than having to, because the watch you can see the values for variables in the watch, but you may have some more complicated data structure that you can't easily debug just through the watch, which you need to really run some more complicated code against to understand the state of. So let's head back to the settings and keep going through them. Studio settings. Go down here one step more. There's one more item in the Studio section that I want to go over, which is Show Diagnostics Bar. We've got this bar down at the bottom of Studio. Well, you wonder, why is that there? Well, if I turn on Show Diagnostics Bar, I've now got the Lua memory and the FPS down in the bottom right here. This is extremely useful because just having the FPS count available and having this Lua memory usage. Sometimes you may want to be kind of keeping an eye on your Lua memory usage and stuff, and the FPS count too. So it's free real estate. There's no reason not to have this on. So I'd highly recommend turning this on, this option, because it's just info that would be empty space otherwise. Now let's go on to the script editor. There's a few interesting things to go over in here, and I'll give you some opinionated advice in this section. So I'll be telling you what I think you should have these values set to. Of course, some people may have different opinions than me, but I have reasonably strong opinions on what you should have this stuff set to. Though, like I said, keep in mind, some other people may have different opinions. So my first opinion is indent using spaces. You can check this to make it indent using spaces instead of tabs. I don't think you should have this option on. All of Roblox's official code and almost all the code in the toolbox, all is indented using tabs. So if you turn this on, you'll kind of be creating a headache for yourself because now your spacing your like indentation will be inconsistent with all the other code in the Roblox ecosystem. So some people turn this on because they prefer spaces, but I think you'll be creating a headache for yourself in the long run if you turn this on. Next option, show whitespace is false by default. I would highly recommend having this set to true, and what this will do is show you these like indications of whitespace. What this really does is if I accidentally add some extra whitespace in my script, this will let me know about it. I'll see it there. So I won't randomly have my cursor being kind of in the wrong place on lines because I accidentally put some whitespace. You'll know about it right away and be able to correct it if you accidentally put whitespace in your script. So I would recommend having this show whitespace option turned on. Another option that I'd recommend having turned on is this rulers. I'd recommend setting a ruler. And what that does is if we look quickly back, it's that little vertical line here. I'd recommend setting a ruler either to 80 or 120 as kind of standard values for that. And the reason for this is it just lets you keep your code kind of at a consistent width. Like the ruler doesn't prevent you from writing longer code. It just gives you a guideline of how to kind of keep your lines not consistently, like not extravagantly long. It's just a reminder to wrap your lines if they're getting super long or break them up into multiple statements. And final thing here, we'll look at script editor color preset. So what are these? Default is the default Roblox color scheme. Custom lets you set whatever you want, but there's also these extra 1 and extra 2. You may not have tried these. What do they do? So it's very simple to explain. Extra 1 is Visual Studio Code's default Lua coloring scheme, and extra 2 is Sublime Text's default Lua coloring scheme. So if you're a user of either Visual Studio Code or Sublime Text, and you like the default coloring scheme there, you also have it in Roblox. You can just click one of these extras, extra 1 for VS Code or extra 2 for Sublime Text, and have the default coloring from that editor in your Roblox Studio editor as well. Next section, that's all I've got for the script editor section. In the network section, right at the top, there's render streamed regions. This is something you should know about if you're working on a place with streaming enabled. Very useful option to have enabled to debug like what's going on with your streaming. More importantly, incoming replication lag. If you're doing serious Roblox development, you should have this set to a non-zero value. This is like super important. For instance, here I have it set to 0.05, which is 20 milliseconds, because this is measured in seconds. So 0.05 is 20 milliseconds. If I set it to 0.2, that would be like 200 milliseconds here. This incoming replication lag will make it so that when I play solo in Studio or play test like multiple players in Studio, there will actually be a built-in lag on the replication. So it'll feel like I'm actually playing over a network. I'll be able to get a feeling for what my code's behavior will actually feel like when it's in a real scenario, like over a network connection that has a delay. This is especially useful if you have a good internet connection, but you want to know, like, what's this going to feel like when someone's playing it on their phone over their terrible Wi-Fi connection? Setting this up to like 0.2 for like 200 milliseconds of delay, that'll give you that terrible Wi-Fi experience and let you know, does my code break when they're in that scenario? So final thing, we'll look at rendering. You can specifically set what quality level. So what I typically do is I have quality level set to 21 for editing. So I see just the maximum fancy graphics for editing. And then I also set quality level for testing down to level 1. Because basically I want to see what this game will actually look like on the like low-end mobile devices that are certainly going to be playing it. So that's a way to do that. I can just force the level down to 1, and this will really show you a different view of kind of just how your game acts when it's actually on a low-power device. So those are all the settings I'm going to go over. So what's a final note to leave everyone with here? So how am I actually doing this presentation? Like I've been kind of nicely skipping between these with nice tweeting and stuff. Well, I'm doing that via a plugin. I've got a plugin here to show me my like talking points and zoom between these. And this is very easy to set up. The code for this plugin is only like 100 lines of code or something to set up a nice plugin to drive this presentation. And this is a general theme. I think people don't use enough plugins in Roblox Studio. It's extremely easy to make a plugin for something, just a quick task. Like if you're doing some repetitive task and you're like, this is really repetitive, I don't like this. Making a plugin is as simple. Once you've like learned kind of the basic plugin APIs, making a plugin is as simple as inserting a script here, right click. I can just say save as local plugin. And for instance, if I save this as a local plugin and make this like a test plugin here. And now I've got this here. This code ran right here. As you can see, my hello world came up from the local plugin. And you can just quickly get very easy way to automate your work. If you're doing something that's repetitive, just make a plugin for it. It's not as hard as it sounds. You can go follow the tutorial on the Dev Hub. Like make use of plugins for stuff like that, because the plugin API is really powerful and lets you do stuff like this. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for watching this presentation.